From a UNESCO point of view, we know sadly that we are not, as a globe, making as much progress towards SDG 4 on education for all, access to high quality education for all, as everyone would hope. And the pandemic over the last 2 years has derailed progress even further. So it's an urgent action, and there's a major summit in New York later this year to try and mobilise world forces to get progress towards SDG back on track, because it's absolutely critical, for all of the other SDGs, but also of course in the context of this afternoon's discussion for pharmacy education and every other kind of higher and further and technical education, that we get that access to education for all really on track. We know that they're deeply intertwined. You cannot have an equitable and accessible higher education system unless, of course, the earlier years of education are properly available to all children wherever they live. And of course, we know that that sadly is not the case. There are geographical challenges, there are of course economic challenges of access to education, there are gender challenges to access to education, and again the pandemic, we believe, is likely to have made many of those big, difficult questions even worse, that there will be children who have dropped out of school, there will be girls who will have dropped out of school, and they may not have the opportunity to re-engage with a quality education. And of course that means their life chances as well as their higher education opportunities are going to be severely restricted. So there isn't a responsibility on higher education, and that's where I've spent my career, really to make the biggest contribution possible to the earlier years, whether that's in mentoring, whether that's in training, whether that's inspiring pupils and teachers. That is really critical. We need to get those earlier years available to everybody and high quality. There's no point children nominally being in school if what they are experiencing when they're in school is not a genuinely enriching educational experience. So there's two challenges: getting all children into school and then ensuring that experience in schools is a really meaningful one that then provides the opportunities to take their education further, including of course in areas of pharmacy and other professional disciplines. Well, of course, we don't want to confound the unequal state of the world in terms of everyone having the opportunity to flourish and have a meaningful personal and professional life. So, I mean, there's a moral, ethical obligation to address these inequities. It's also really important that perhaps we also think quite widely about what we've learned over the last few years about having to adapt at very high speed to new forms of delivery. Is there something in those experiences that can help address the inequities in higher and indeed school education in new ways? Can we make professional access to professional education more geographically accessible, more flexibly accessible for people who have caring or other responsibilities? You know, what can we learn from our experiences during the pandemic that could actually bootstrap really making rapid progress to address some of the inequalities that we've all been talking about and working on for many years, but sadly have not entirely overcome the challenges? Well, one of the groups who have some of the biggest challenges in terms of accessing education and higher education are migrants and refugees. And one of the pieces of work that I've been involved in recently as a result of UNESCO's activities to have a global convention in the recognition of higher education qualifications, I've been pushing, and the UK has now ratified. We're nearly at the stage where there will be 20 member states, which means it will come into force. And that gives a right to have qualifications fairly assessed wherever you studied. And that's going to be increasingly important. And one of the elements of the convention is that will include processes that member states will have to introduce to fairly assess qualifications achieved by migrants and refugees. And I recently was on a panel at the World Higher Education Conference in Barcelona, and amongst other older and senior people, there was a really inspirational young woman who was a refugee who had fled, and she and her family were in Germany, and at one point she was being told she would have to go back to primary school because she wasn't able to prove the educational attainments that she had achieved in her home country, but through some pilot projects about recognition of qualifications for refugees, she has been able to access college and then university education. And you know, that was an inspirational story of somebody in the most difficult of circumstances, then apparently going to have her life completely made even more difficult because of the inability to prove her educational attainments, but also a way forward. And I think those kind of examples and the Global Convention and some of the pilot studies that UNESCO has been doing on refugee passports will be critically important in this space. And if we don't do that, the amount of talent that we will be wasting globally, never mind the human tragedies of each individual case. But I'm really pleased that the Global Convention and other activities will make that an obligation on member states to take that issue of access really seriously. And it will be important because the Global Convention doesn't actually focus on professional qualifications, because we know that is a space where the professions are active. But I think some of the innovative approaches that have been adopted, where you can interview people about their attainments and not necessarily require paperwork. Sadly, when people flee their countries, they don't often grab their high school or degree certificates, so there has to be an innovative approach, which I'm sure in your profession and others people can devise to check, because it's important, of course, that people are suitably qualified to embark on further training or professional work. But it can't all just be based on a traditional "here's my degree certificate," because sadly that will exclude hundreds of thousands of people all around the world. I'm sure you and your colleagues in the pharmacy profession are already thinking many of these thoughts, but I mean there's several elements. There is the making accessible what the profession requires, what it does, both for the society but also for the individual. Sometimes we are reluctant to actually be sufficiently open about the values and the enrichment that following particular professional pathways brings to the individuals in those professions. So getting those stories out there, particularly to communities and groups who may not have that kind of professional experience in their own social networks. So it's the mentoring, it's the communication, it's the engaging with schools, and it's the role modelling piece. We know this is important, that, for example, in parts of Africa, access to higher education is still more gendered than in other parts of the world. There aren't as many young women going into higher education, so we need to show them career paths where they will recognise the needs in their communities, and they will recognise a professional path that they can take to address those needs. But we also need to be aware, and there's been a lot of evidence of this in terms of mentoring, role modelling, public engagement, that we mustn't overload people who perhaps are in the minority in the profession. So it's important that if there are fewer women professors of pharmacy, that they are not overloaded with all of the responsibility for the mentoring and the engagement and the public engagement. This is an important role that must be shared amongst the profession. But those communication, those engagements, those role modelling experiences, I think, are absolutely critical, and I'm sure your colleagues are already engaged in it. But perhaps with the experience of having to do much more online, are there ways that we can reach out geographically further in terms of where pharmacy education is provided? It's a very specialist profession, clearly, so is there a way of making it more geographically accessible in different parts of the world through a mixture of new technologies? So, you know, what can we do as a profession to make this important role accessible to more people? Perhaps the traditional "you study for X years full-time" is not the only model. What can we do to make this a career path that more people from more backgrounds with more demographic characteristics can engage on meaningfully? One of of the biggest inequities in higher education in general, and pharmacy education I'm sure is no different, is obviously the economic costs of training. And through your professional networks, I'm sure you're already doing activities around scholarship and financial support, but if the greater profile that pharmacy and pharmacy education has achieved as a pandemic, is there something your powerful network can do to do more in the scholarship space? The other thing that I think it's really important is, is there even more that your colleagues can do in terms of supporting and mentoring perhaps people from backgrounds where in their families they don't have a lot of experience of higher education, so that more students have access to the kind of support that in more affluent families comes almost with the territory about what it means to study a professional degree, a university degree. Is there a space there, again using technology, so that it doesn't all need to be perhaps taking up time and travelling, but it's really the finance and support for underrepresented groups that I would say would be a key challenge that I'm sure you and your members would rise to. So I'm giving you some ideas from my general engagement and knowledge of what's happening in UNESCO in higher education, but the really powerful thing that I think you and your colleagues can do is learn from one another. If there's a project that is working well in one part of the world, how can we scale it up? So please use the power of your networks to share good practice, because you know the situation in pharmacy education better than anyone else. So carry on the good work, I would say, is my final thought.